Who needs normal when you've got thrill? That's what I thought, buzzing with excitement as I packed my bag for the weekend. It was like I was in some steamy movie, sneaking off to meet Mark, my lover, leaving behind a life that felt like a worn-out sweater. The plan? A cabin, tucked away in the woods, where nobody would know us. But life's got a way of throwing curveballs. Before I could slip out, there was Jake, my husband, standing in the hallway, his eyes like searchlights. "I know something's up," he said, his voice steady but his hands trembling. "Don't do this." He might as well have been talking to the walls. I brushed past him, muttering some half-baked excuse. Couldn't he see? I needed more, something he stopped giving me years ago. Mark was waiting, that mischievous grin of his lighting up as I approached. We didn't waste time, hitting the road, the city fading in our rearview mirror. The cabin was like a postcard from an adventure magazine, all rustic charm and wild, unspoiled nature. Perfect for what we had in mind. But while we were playing house, Jake wasn't sitting idle. Turned out, he hired some private eye to tail me. Like a scene out of a noir film, except I was the one in the crosshairs. And there was someone else, a shadow, lurking just beyond the reach of the cabin lights. I noticed it first when I stepped outside for air. A flicker of movement, then nothing. I shrugged it off as forest critters, but Mark seemed on edge, glancing over his shoulder more than once. Should have paid more attention to that feeling, the one that makes your neck hairs stand up. But I was too caught up, too lost in a world where consequences felt like myths. Little did I know, our little escapade was turning into something much darker, a story with twists I never saw coming. "Look at this," I said, flipping my phone to Mark, showing him a weird text that popped up. "Probably a wrong number," I laughed, brushing off the chill running down my spine. It read, "You're playing with fire. I mean, what are the odds, right? Just a coincidence." Mark just shrugged, his mind elsewhere, but I could tell something was bugging him. He kept glancing out the window, his usual cool demeanor replaced with this edgy vibe. "Do you think we're safe here?" he asked out of the blue. I rolled my eyes. "It's a cabin in the woods, not a spy movie set," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. Then, my phone buzzed again. It was a call from Jen, my so-called best friend. The moment I answered, she was all like, "I need to talk to you about." But before she could finish, the call dropped. Weird, right? But things were about to get weirder. I tried calling her back, no answer. That's when Mark's face went white as a sheet. "What's wrong?" I asked. He just pointed to his phone. Notifications were flooding and our joint accounts were being frozen. One after another, just like that. My stomach dropped. Jake. He knew. And he was hitting where it hurt. In the middle of this financial Armageddon, Mark started pacing around, peering through the blinds like some paranoid detective. "Someone's watching us," he muttered. I wanted to say he was being ridiculous, but after the text, the call, and now this money mess, I wasn't so sure. That's when I noticed it. A tiny red light, almost invisible, nestled in the corner of the bookshelf. A camera. My heart stopped. We were being recorded. All this time. Every laugh, every kiss, every secret whispered between the sheets. Someone had seen it all. The room felt like it was closing in on me. Mark's face was a picture of horror. "Who would do this?" he whispered. I wish I knew. But one thing was crystal clear: our secret getaway was turning into a nightmare, and there was no waking up from it. Panic hit me like a wave when our car wouldn't start. "This can't be happening," I muttered, trying the ignition again and again. Mark was fumbling under the hood, cursing under his breath. Our romantic getaway had turned into a horror show, and now, we were stuck. That's when he appeared. A man, out of nowhere, striding towards us. His eyes were locked on Mark, burning with a rage I'd never seen. "Long time no see, Mark," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Mark's face went pale. "Rick?" he gasped. Rick, as it turned out, was Mark's former business partner. And boy, did he have a story to tell. Betrayal, stolen money, and a criminal past that Mark never mentioned. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. Who was this man I'd run away with? As Rick's story unfolded, it became clear. Mark wasn't just a lover in a boring marriage like me. He was a con artist, and Rick was his latest victim. I was standing there, caught in the crossfire of their twisted past. That's when things took a turn for the worse. Rick, fueled by vengeance, grabbed Mark. There was a struggle, a shout, and then he dragged Mark away into the woods. I was left there, alone, my mind a blur of fear and confusion. Meanwhile, Jake, my husband, had gotten wind of the danger. The pie he'd hired was feeding him live updates. I can only imagine his shock, realizing the mess I'd gotten myself into. He was on his way to the cabin, but I had no idea. All I knew was I was alone, my lover kidnapped, and my world crumbling around me. In the eerie silence of the cabin, with Mark gone and danger lurking, I was frozen. The man I'd risked everything for was a stranger, and now he was in the hands of an angry, vengeful man. I was out of my depth, in a nightmare with no clear way out. There I was, in the middle of nowhere, my phone as useless as a brick. No signal. Each attempt to call for help was met with dead silence, leaving me feeling more isolated than ever. Panic and desperation were setting in fast. Mark, regardless of his lies, was in danger, and somehow, I felt responsible. In a frantic search for anything useful, I stumbled upon a gun hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin. I'd never handled a gun before, but there was no time to hesitate. I grabbed it, feeling its cold, ominous weight in my hands. It was time to take matters into my own hands. As I stepped outside, the eerie quiet of the woods surrounded me. Every sound, from the rustling leaves to my own footsteps, seemed amplified in the silence. I had no plan, no idea where Rick had taken Mark, but I had to try something. Meanwhile, Jake, my husband, arrived at the cabin. The sight that greeted him must have been a shock. Our car abandoned, the cabin door ajar, signs of a struggle everywhere. He knew something had gone terribly wrong. Little did he know, I was out there, armed and dangerously unprepared. I tracked them down, following the faintest of trails left behind. And there they were, in a small clearing. Rick had Mark on his knees, a gun pointed at his head. My heart was in my throat as I stepped into the clearing, the hidden gun in my hand trembling. "Let him go, Rick," I yelled, more bravely than I felt. The standoff was tense, each of us with our weapons drawn, a deadly triangle in the middle of the wilderness. Just then, Jake appeared, his expression a mix of anger, shock, and fear. He saw me, gun in hand, facing off with a stranger, his brother's life in the balance. The situation was spiraling out of control, and I could see the disbelief in his eyes. How had our lives come to this? The air was thick with tension, each of us waiting for someone else to make a move. It was a standoff that could end in tragedy, and I was right in the middle of it, my choices leading me to this unthinkable moment. In the tense silence of the standoff, Rick's voice cut through, sharp and bitter. "You know what your lover's been up to?" He spat at me, his eyes wild. "Mark's a thief, a con man. He's been running a financial scam, and I was his mark." My world spun. Mark? A scam artist? It couldn't be. But Mark's silence said it all. His head hung low, the truth written all over him. I felt like a fool, a pawn in his game. The gun in my hand felt heavier, my heart pounding against my chest. "Is it true?" I asked, barely a whisper. Before Mark could answer, chaos erupted. Rick lunged forward, Mark moved, and in the panic, my finger squeezed the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the woods. Mark fell, a look of disbelief on his face. I stood frozen, the smoking gun in my hand, my mind unable to process what I'd done. Jake rushed forward, tackling Rick to the ground. He was like a man possessed, fueled by rage and betrayal. In mere seconds, he had Rick pinned down, his own anguish mirrored in his fierce actions. As I dropped the gun, my legs gave way. Mark lay on the ground, blood seeping through his shirt. His eyes met mine, filled with a sad kind of love. "I did love you," he whispered, his voice fading. And then, he was gone. My lover, my mistake, my tragedy. The sound of sirens tore through the air, breaking the surreal bubble we were in. The police swarmed in, securing the scene, their questions rapid and relentless. Rick was handcuffed and led away, his revenge incomplete but devastating nonetheless. I sat there, numb and disoriented, as the officers pieced together the story. Jake stood a distance away, his expression unreadable. The man I had betrayed, the man who had come to save us, now a stranger filled with disappointment and hurt. In the middle of the chaos, the reality of what had happened hit me. I had pulled the trigger. My actions had consequences far beyond anything I could have imagined. The affair, the lies, the escape, it had all led to this moment of irreversible tragedy. Handcuffed and led away, the cold reality of my situation hit me like a ton of bricks. Detained for the unintentional shooting of Mark, I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Each step towards the police car was a descent into a reality I never imagined I'd face. In the interrogation room, the truth spilled out, messy, ugly, and damning. The officers looked at me not with sympathy, but with a sort of detached professionalism. I was just another case to them, another headline for the evening news. And oh, how the media feasted on the story. Local woman shoots lover in tragic love triangle, the headlines screamed. My face, twisted in grief and shock, plastered across every news site and TV screen. I was no longer a person. I was a scandal, a cautionary tale, a source of morbid fascination. In the midst of this, I clung to a sliver of hope that Jake, my husband, would come through for me. But that hope was shattered when my lawyer bluntly told me, he's not bailing you out. Jake's heartbreak had turned to stone. He couldn't look past the betrayal, the lies, and now, the irreversible damage I'd caused. It wasn't just Jake. Friends who I thought would stand by me turned their backs. Family members expressed their disgust, unable to reconcile the person they knew with the one splashed across the tabloids. The isolation was suffocating, each severed tie a reminder of what I'd lost. And then there was jail. The first night in my cell, the harsh reality finally sank in. The cold, hard cot, the echoing sounds of despair from other inmates, the stark walls, they all screamed at me. This is real. This is your life now. Lying there, in the darkness, the full extent of my mistakes hit me. I had ventured recklessly into an affair, blinded by excitement and naivety. I had ignored every warning, dismissed every risk. And now, here I was, paying the price for my choices. A price that included not just my freedom, but the destruction of my marriage, my reputation, and a life lost by my own hand. The weight of guilt and regret was crushing. I replayed every decision, every moment that led me here, each memory a sharp jab of pain. I had thought I was seeking something more, something exciting. But in the end, I'd lost everything. And the cost? Far more than I ever imagined I'd have to pay. The day I was released on bail was the day my world officially crumbled. Stepping outside, I was greeted not by freedom, but by a sea of hostile faces and flashing cameras. The public's eyes were unforgiving, their whispers sharp as knives. I was a pariah, a woman scorned and shamed. As I navigated through the crowd, a single, soul-crushing piece of news reached me. Jake had filed for divorce and full custody of our kids. The thought of losing my children, my only anchor in this storm, was unbearable. But who could blame him? After all, I was the woman who had shattered our family, the mother who had risked it all for a fleeting affair. Back at what used to be our home, the reality of my new life hit hard. My bank accounts were frozen, my credit cards nothing more than useless plastic. Jake had made sure I couldn't access a penny. Every drawer I opened, every room I walked into, screamed of a life that was no longer mine. In desperation, I reached out to Mark's family, hoping for some understanding, maybe even help. But the response was as cold as the winter air. "You're the reason he's dead," his sister spat through the phone before hanging up. The rejection was a blow, a confirmation of my worst fears. I was alone, utterly and completely. And then came the lawsuit. Jake's lawyer, a man who once greeted me with warm smiles at dinner parties, now looked at me with disdain. "You're being sued for damages," he said, sliding the papers across the table. The numbers were astronomical, figures that spun my head. Jake wasn't just cutting ties. He was making sure I paid for every mistake, every lie, every moment of betrayal. Sitting in the empty house, surrounded by memories of a life that felt like someone else's, I realized the gravity of my actions. The affair, once a thrilling escape, had cost me everything: my family, my security, my dignity. And now, it was demanding even more. The price of my freedom, it seemed, was a life in ruins. With nowhere to go and no one to turn to, I found myself wandering the streets, a ghost of my former self. The houses where I once was welcomed now shut their doors in my face. Friends, neighbors, even distant relatives, everyone seemed to have turned their backs on me. The cold indifference of the world was a harsh reminder of how far I'd fallen. In a moment of sheer desperation, I showed up at Jake's door. I begged, pleaded for forgiveness, for a chance to explain, to make things right. But his gaze was steely, his heart sealed shut. "You're dead to me," he said, his voice void of the warmth I once knew. The door closed, leaving me alone with my regrets and the chilling realization that I had lost him forever. The trial was a blur. I sat there, a spectator in the tragic play that was my life. The evidence was overwhelming, each piece like a nail in the coffin of my fate. The photos, the texts, the gun, all painting a picture of a woman lost in her own selfish desires. Then came Rick's testimony, the man I barely knew, yet whose life I had unwittingly entangled with mine. He laid bare Mark's criminal activities, painting a picture of deceit and betrayal. I listened, each word a confirmation of my ignorance and naivety. I had been a pawn in a game I didn't even know I was playing. When the verdict was read, it felt like a final, crushing blow. Guilty of involuntary manslaughter. The words echoed in my head, a relentless reminder of that fateful moment in the woods. The judge's voice seemed distant, yet each word weighed heavily on my soul. I had started this journey seeking excitement, a break from the monotony of my life. But as I sat there, condemned by the law and abandoned by the world, I realized the true cost of my actions. I had sought thrill, but found tragedy. I had reached for love, but grasped only loss. In my quest for something more, I had lost everything. The clang of the prison gates closing behind me was like the final note in a symphony of my downfall. Sentenced to several years, each day stretched out before me, a relentless expanse of gray walls and echoing footsteps. Prison life was harsh, a far cry from the world I once knew. I was an outcast, ostracized by inmates who saw in me the embodiment of their scorn. I quickly learned to keep to myself, finding solace in the solitude. The other inmates had their own stories, their own reasons for being here, but none seemed to care for mine. My past, splashed across the news, had preceded me. Whispers followed me like shadows, my notoriety a barrier to any semblance of normalcy in this place. Outside these walls, life went on. The most painful blow came when I heard Jake had remarried. The news trickled in through the grapevine of letters and visiting day chatter. He had moved on, building a new life, a new family, while I remained a ghost of his past. The thought of him with someone else, living the life we once shared, was a bitter pill to swallow. My children, the lights of my life, became distant stars, unreachable in my universe. They refused to visit, their silence more deafening than any words of hatred. The pain of their rejection cut deeper than any physical barrier could. I was not only a prisoner of walls but also of my own making, isolated from the very people I loved most. And then, as if the universe hadn't finished with me, came the revelation that shattered the last vestige of my fantasy. Mark, the man I had risked everything for, had not been the person I thought he was. I learned from a fellow inmate, who had heard it through the prison grapevine, that Mark had been involved with other women, other lives he had carelessly entangled in his web of lies. My idealized image of him, the man I believed loved me and only me, crumbled. I was left with the truth, a truth that stung with betrayal and humiliation. In this cold, unforgiving place, I was forced to confront the reality of my choices. The walls around me were a constant reminder of the consequences of my actions. Each day was a battle, not just against the hardships of prison life, but against the regrets and what-ifs that plagued my mind. I had lost everything, my family, my freedom, my self-respect, all for a love that was nothing more than a mirage. Prison life, with its relentless stress and harsh conditions, took its toll on me. I felt my health slipping away, a gradual decline that mirrored the disintegration of my life outside these walls. Sleepless nights blended into exhausting days, each moment a reminder of my fall from grace. In a desperate attempt to reconnect, I penned letters to my family. Words of apology, of longing, spilled onto the pages, my heart poured out in ink. But each letter returned, unopened, unacknowledged. Their silence was a resounding confirmation of my isolation, the final severing of bonds I had once held dear. As if my personal despair wasn't enough, rumors began circulating about a tell-all book detailing the scandal that was my life. My mistakes, my affair, my trial all laid bare for public consumption. The thought of my story, twisted and sensationalized for entertainment, was a new kind of humiliation. It was as if the world refused to let me fade away quietly, insisting on dragging me through the mud once more. The media, once so fixated on my every move, gradually lost interest. New scandals emerged, new stories to captivate the public's fickle attention. I became a footnote, a forgotten character in the ever-churning news cycle. From a sensational headline to a mere whisper in the past that was my legacy. Alone in my cell, the weight of my choices bore down on me. The quiet was suffocating, filled only with the echoes of my regrets. I thought of Jake, of our children, of the life I had torn apart. I thought of Mark, the man who had ignited a flame that consumed everything I held dear. And I thought of myself, the woman I once was and the stranger I had become. In the silence of my solitude, I confronted the reality of my actions. Every decision, every step that led me here, was a reflection of my own making. The affair, once a thrilling escape, had led me down a path of destruction. I had sought love and excitement, but found only loss and despair. As I lay on my cot, staring at the blank ceiling, the truth was inescapable. I was the architect of my downfall, the author of my tragedy. The consequences of my actions were mine to bear, a burden that weighed heavily on my soul. In the end, I was left with nothing but time. Time to reflect on the catastrophic choices that had led me to this cold, lonely cell. Time to mourn the life I had lost, the people I had hurt, the love I had squandered. And time to face the harsh truth that I was the only one to blame for the shattered pieces of my existence.